excited to have Keith Koo back on the podcast from here in the Experience Center. Thanks for joining us, Keith.
Thanks for having me, Megan. It's great to be back.
Yeah. So Keith Koo, investment banker, host of a radio show.
Well, thanks, Megan. And I have to commend you and the NTT Global team again for just putting on a really great event during the Data and AI Summit here in San Francisco.
Thanks, Keith. So what's your point of view on this topic of democratizing data in the enterprise? I know you have a lot of opinions about this.
Well, thanks for asking. Democratizing data in the enterprise, I mean, it's something that's not new. When I first started at Cisco over 2 decades ago, and my boss actually also had data warehousing. Democratizing data has been something that we've always been striving for. And I'll just give a little bit of history, right? So when I left Cisco, I went to Intuit. The chief data scientist was formerly from Yahoo. Was talking about how data at the time was, the way we couched it over a decade ago, was that Google and Yahoo had lots of data, but it was like data smog. I mean, what was good, nobody really knew how to analyze the data back then. And then Intuit, for example, had all this data around financials. You had tax data, you had small business data, but for governmental regulation reasons, we weren't able to share that. And then what do you do with that data? So I think here we are all these years later. I think democratizing data is still kind of the goal, but really hasn't been as achievable for lots of different reasons. And Peter Drucker had a quote way back in like the early 2000s before he passed that we were getting to this point of having data smog, right? So
wow, Peter Drucker.
Right.
Going back.
Yeah.
This has been a conversation. I hear what you're saying here. This has been going on for a while, thinking about democratizing, trying to get a handle on all this data.
Yeah, so I think the concept of democratizing data has been about, we're now collecting all this data.
Yeah.
So what do we do with it?
Right. So I think you have some interesting stats, right, about how much data really matters. Do I have that?
Yeah, I think that because we're collecting all this data, and that's why I think a conference like Data and AI Summit, right? You're talking about like ETL versus ELT, right? I mean, I think that transforming the data, which I'm an advocate for on the ETL part of it, I think that becomes important because we have so much data and we ingest it. From an enterprise perspective, so speaking from enterprise experience, is that it's expensive. There's so much. If you were to ingest all data that your enterprise is collecting, your customers are generating, your sales team or your operations team, it becomes really expensive. I can think about when I'm again dating myself, when I did one of the very first enterprise deals for a really well-known data company. I won't mention who it is, but they were charging by the terabyte, and then we have petabytes now, right?
Right.
And the business model was such that every terabyte that was ingested, once you hit your cap on the enterprise side, they will still transform, they'll still collect it, but they won't allow you to see it.
So what I hear you saying is we've got cost, we've got history. Help us understand, where you think this is going to go with, AI being so compelling for business transformation and sort of unlocking opportunities for efficiency and productivity to kind of crack through the cost and challenge.
Well, it's a good question. And it's always the cost in the operating technology is always slower. So to that question, I think that AI creates a set of issues before it solves the issue. The AI is now the ability to replicate or to create much more data than you're anticipating. And then how do you actually weed all through that? Now, you could use AI and ML to actually streamline that, make it more efficient, be able to discard information that you don't need. So I think that's going to be really cool. On the other hand, you now have to come up from a bank perspective to come up with ways to actually monitor the data and whether it's actually doing what's anticipated. Because what's going to happen is that the processing speed of the models being generating the data is faster than the ability for the humans and or right now the solutions to process that data.
Looks like an opportunity for the startup ecosystem to address some of these issues on data quality, data observability. Do I have that?
You are exactly right. I think I see a lot in my role as an investor that there's a lot of mid and late career founders and startups. I think they're going to do really well. Right? There's a statistic that most of the recent startup founders that have been successful, they're over 40 years old. So I think I say that because you need that enterprise background in order to jump out, or if jumping out and starting your company, to understand the enterprise mindset. Because what's happening with startups who have no enterprise background, they don't understand any of the operational parts that an NTT would, as an example, because they haven't had that enterprise experience. And without knowing that, you're not going to have the awareness of regulations for some industries or the operational cost and efficiencies. You're not going to actually be able to create a solution that your target base.
Right. I see you need the experience, the context. Some of the other folks we were interviewing today really talked about this value chain. And it's quite layered in terms of what's required to make all of this work and also stay in compliance with GDPR and all the rest of it. And, from a legal perspective, I know you have a point of view about how enterprises need to be thinking about that, and maybe even slow down the pace of adopting some of these use cases.
I think you're exactly right. I think that, at least for what I know in the current state of the United States, that only financial services like big banks are fully regulated to the model level. So you have all these other companies that are developing models right now. My prediction is that the elements that we have from the financial services industry, model risk management, is going to become more important. And what's going to happen is just we saw this with cybersecurity, is that as unforeseen consequences of being able to create data with AI and ML, whether it's a social media company that has violated something in content moderation, whether it's I see it all the time right now in terms of generative AI. So lots of these large language models, which is not just text, but it's also images. There's a lot of unintended consequences on data that's generated from that. So if you're an enterprise, there's a reason why LLMs like ChatGPT have what we call bias filters, because an OpenAI does not want to be nailed for some content that's generated from their platform.
Right. Yeah. So, well, it looks like we need to watch this space, Keith, and I can't wait to have you back when we look at this through the lens of different industries and maybe even calling from the future when we have you back.
Well, thanks, Megan. And I did want to say this one last thing is sitting through the panel today, which is very informative. I think companies like NTT, which has a global presence, are in a good position to actually be a leader in how we intersect between the needs of the enterprise and the needs of the public. Because when I talk about the importance of AI and ML and people ask me about democratization or they ask me about regulation, it's all jurisdiction specific. So the way that the US handles data versus the way China handles data or Russia handles data or the EU handles data, I think companies are going to have to be forced in a type of global thought leadership function. So thanks again.
Wow. Well, thank you for that, and agree. Global does make a lot of sense for some of these, especially when we start looking at platforms and scale. We're all in this together.
All right. Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks.